Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. We're hosting the Education-Led Growth Summit today, so a full day of virtual events here where you can join us and learn how companies are using education to drive business growth. So my name's Shannon. I'll be the host of this session. We'll have Audrey and I will go back and forth in hosting today, but I'm excited to introduce you to Antonio here in just a moment, and he's going to be talking about personalizing learning with AI. Which is something I know has been top of mind for a lot of us. And Antonio, this is kind of what he does, is teach people this. And I think you're in for a treat here. Just some very practical walkthroughs. Before we get started, just some housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded. So if you do have to drop off at some point, if you want to share it with a colleague, you want to come back and capture some of the slides, you will get a copy of the recording emailed to you tomorrow morning. The chat is open. We would love to hear from you as we're going throughout the day. We just love hearing from you, knowing like who's on the call, where are you calling in from? I know Antonio's not home today. He's in Ohio doing or did you say Ohio or Chicago? Doing some new
Yeah.
hire training.
Ohio.
Ohio. Yeah, doing some new hire training, actually walking people through AI. He'll introduce himself and share a little bit more about what he does at SEI. If you need closed captions, those are going to be at the bottom of your screen here. Also, Antonio is going to take some questions as he's teaching today. So if you have a question, please use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That just helps. Sometimes the chat blows up and we lose questions. The Q&A box just helps us make sure that we can get your questions answered. During the summit, we're also going to keep the conversation going on LinkedIn. So join us in the chat, but also, share what you're learning on LinkedIn, connect with each other on LinkedIn. We'd love to see you there using the hashtag Education-Led Growth 2025. I'll put that in the chat in just a moment here. Yeah, and then I'm going to go to this next slide. And actually, Jason and Antonio from SEI were going to join us today. Jason's actually enjoying some much deserved time off in Maine, where Antonio and I were saying, I don't know that I've ever been in Maine with great Wi-Fi. So Jason won't be joining us today, but Antonio Manueco is going to be, he's a national practice lead for technology and AI. And also just like a really gifted breaking this down, right? So like I would say AI is a pretty big complex topic, and he's going to walk us through like how do we actually wrap our heads around this, understand it, and learn how to apply it to personalized training. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn it over to Antonio to share a little bit more about himself and then jump in.
All right. Let me now take over a second. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yes, yes, I see.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right, awesome. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Shannon, for that introduction. As she mentioned, so I'm the National Practice Lead for Technology and Artificial Intelligence at SEI. Focus really, or the background has always been in very kind of software-oriented architecture, automation, and then of course, how do you actually start transforming the workforce as you're looking for types of training and everything that you need to do from a business perspective to be able to hire teams of high quality. Jason Davis, also who's our managing director out of New York. He has about over 18 years of experience in management consulting. And he spent a ton of time on HCM and everything kind of from an enterprise training and customer training perspective. Anyways, there we go. Okay, so agenda for today. So a couple of housekeeping things as well. Please, as Shannon mentioned, drop any questions on the chat. Anything that comes up. I really not a huge lecture style person, but I like things to be interactive. So as things come up, please just put them on the chat and we can field them appropriately. So today, in terms of agenda, we're going to do a quick introduction. What problem are we really solving with this? Kind of timing and what we're seeing in the industry. What does it actually mean to be what does it actually mean in the field of like personalized training? What is evidence-based training and what are the building blocks, along with slicing content and how we actually be able to do that. So as I mentioned, a little bit of myself, a software and architecture background, heavy on the engineering side. I'm married with 2 kids. I say that a lot because people, we think a lot of people that are in the AI and engineering space, they think of us as robots. So I just want to make sure that I am, to tell you I am human and I do have a family. I spent a lot of time in logistics. So I have a master's in logistics. I've been a network engineer back in the early 2000s before cloud and kind of everything from a hybrid perspective, which of course introduces a lot of challenges and a lot of kind of context switching and learning paths. And I've been an entrepreneur and fractional CTO almost my entire life. I've been now at SCI for 5 years. Big productivity junkie, so I spend a lot of time kind of looking at things and being able to understand how I can be more efficient with my time. So I like automating a lot of the mundane things, which is, of course, then translates into systems. And that's how you kind of see this presentation, right? Is what is the system or framework to be able to achieve what we want to achieve? I love sports, games, travel, find interest in everything and anything. And yeah, please, you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. We'd love to continue this conversation. So what we're doing today in about 45 minutes or so, you'll see how AI can reshape a single curriculum into thousands of right-sized paths without blowing up your production schedule, what it takes to pilot this in your organization. So this is not a technical implementation. So this is not a how to actually deploy it. This is more of a framework or a system that then you can use whatever tools you want to be able to then create these particular kind of personalized sessions for your employees. So principles that really can be applied in so many different ways. So it's a way of thinking and how to actually start kind of thinking about how to be able to do this or deliver personalized training. So the problem that we're trying to solve is, and this has been in education for a very long time, is that one size fits all kind of curriculum, right? We see this in high schools, we see this throughout education sector, especially in the United States, where you have these kind of uplifted or gifted kind of curriculums or classes where there's kids that learn a little bit faster. So by putting them in the same class with everyone else, then you're really impeding kind of that education, right? So we've always had this problem of this notion of like, hey, let's just build a curriculum and everybody's going to learn the same thing. So that's that. It really fails to really address a lot of your unique needs, our backgrounds, our culture. How do we actually like learning? Visual? Is it micro kind of pieces? Is it more of a concept and then kind of supporting, or do you build ideas all the way to a big concept? Right. So everyone has a little bit of a different flavor to do that, and it's not sustainable to build all of this individually. So we kind of think about how to actually automate a lot of this stuff. And of course, what we know is that when you have this one size fits all, the people that are really advanced, they usually get disengaged. There's limited growth. So it has a lot of kind of bad connotations to it, which is why we're starting to kind of think this way in personalized training. So lots and lots of research proving this. So how does AI help in training and learning? So obviously one of the big things is faster curriculum design, right? Authoring and publishing, and Intellum has a perfect tool to be able to start actually doing that and be able to design these things and be able to actually, open them up to the public. It makes our administrative efforts when we talk about training much easier. Support also becomes a little bit more automated, so you get to spend time as a company actually developing more value add rather than supporting and troubleshooting. It allows us to be continuous, scalable, and it allows us to start getting personalized because now we have enough teachers in AI that allows us to then be able to actually have this kind of one-on-one relationship with agents. And it also gives us immediate and detailed feedback, right? So you can design, we've done all sorts of curriculums where if you're learning X, Y, and Z, we always look at how much of that you're actually grasping. We look for tonality, we look for sentiment analysis, and all of these things kind of combine to see, how much you're actually getting out of what the business is intending for you to learn. Let me just check the chat real quick, make sure that there's, okay, cool. Yeah, so no questions here. And feel free to put it in the chat, any questions. Oh, all right. So timing and crystal ball. So why now? And the reality is that the workforce is becoming very, very, very competitive. And what you're starting to see is that you have these tools and you have these agents that really allow you to almost upskill without having to have a professional or somebody to mentor you, right? So AI is almost acting like this mentorship. So a lot of this is really forcing the workforce to now deliver faster, deliver at a better quality. And that really kind of starts, it almost starts leveling the field across all different kind of competencies, right? And the reason why why now is because a little company named OpenAI said, okay, well, let's just open up this to the world and then just have it in a chat interface where you can kind of start talking to these LLMs and you can use it for whatever it is. So that really has now allowed us to start thinking about personalization at scale. A lot of people, tied to the competitive workforce, a lot of people are fearful of losing their jobs to AI. So some of the big examples that we continue seeing, like in marketing. So a lot of marketing companies, everything that has to do from the operational side of marketing is being taken by AI. So there's a lot of different things from, if you start looking at it from responsibilities or kind of aptitude for work, you're looking at AI really entering those lower layers and then putting pressure up, which means that now everyone that is kind of being affected by that, you need to start upskilling, and AI is a perfect tool to be able to start doing that. The AI learning market today is estimated to be about $6.5 million, and it's expected to be about $112 billion in 10 years, right? So, like, think about the magnitude of where the focus is starting to become. And it's a new market because that, by what I mentioned, right? LLMs have really allowed us to start kind of pushing the envelope in terms of what we want to do, right? And then, of course, capital and institutional money follows that to really support that. And then there's a lot of promising initial results. There's a ton of companies that are doing really, really cool stuff that allows us to do a little bit better, that allows us to do a bit more personalized, allows us to design the curriculum much faster, as I mentioned. So there's a lot of promising results across the board, which then leads to motivation, increase in motivation, increase in engagement, increase in accuracy, and then post-assessment scores, which really allows us to understand if the curriculum or what we're trying to teach our workforce is actually capturing the intent. So the future of the workforce, it's a really interesting one, and this is one that I always have very deep conversations around, philosophical changes, what technology is really pushing. So if you really think about kind of 10 years, 20, 30-year horizon, what we think is going to start happening is that skills will become less and less relevant because you're going to have this suite of tools and mentors and kind of technical skills that is going to be able to do a lot of the stuff, right? So essentially what you're doing is that you're creating this layer where everyone can now start delivering at the same type of quality, right? So that introduces some really interesting kind of societal changes into the mix. One of the things that comes up is, okay, well, if you can't differentiate yourself in skills, well, what is going to differentiate you? So we're also thinking that a lot of the stuff, especially in the educational side, and now has to start focusing on the creativity, on the personality, on the values, and that's going to be greater than knowledge and skills, right? And how do we get there is through personalized training over a long period of time. So we're talking about kind of macro effects that this will have over time, which of course then introduces these questions, right? Like, what's the purpose then? Can we sustain innovation if we're just accelerating a lot of our delivery because we have these things that can do research much faster, that can produce outputs much faster, right? So is that sustainable? What happens when we've reached a peak where everything is just, kind of continuous innovation or even on a daily basis? Will it also impact inequality? Will there be new forms in inequality because now you have, if everyone has the same skills, well, what happens to everything surrounding that, right? So are we going to now start judging because of creativity or personality rather than judging because you lack or you have more skills? So it's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition that this introduces. Again, right, what is the motivation? What is the purpose of the workforce? Like, how are we kind of, landing on a lot of these things? So in conclusion, it's really not today's problem that we're trying to solve. And it's absolutely something that we cannot solve in 30-ish minutes, right? So it's just something that we want to think through because it is going to come down to the education that we give our workforce that is really going to allow us to then differentiate businesses in what the job market will look like tomorrow. All right, so personalized training. So first, we need to define what personalization means. And if we can agree and kind of come off on this foundation, then I think we'll be good for the rest of the presentation. So if we go and we define this, personalization, I defined it as personalized training is the antithesis of a one-size-fits-all program. So, take the problem statement that we have that one-size-fits-all programs really are not the most effective when you're looking at a wide array of employees or individuals. So this is the complete opposite, right? Not one size fits all. We're going to go personalized, and it's offering a targeted, an adaptive, and engaging approach that maximizes the learner growth and organizational outcomes. So this is the kind of the definition that we're going to go off when we talk about personalization. How do we go and away from the problem and closer to a solution? So what's the value of AI in personalization? Scalability, experts, teachers. There's not enough teachers or mentors in the world that can actually take every single human that is trying to be upskilling and be able to actually write a curriculum or change a curriculum for a particular person for them to be able to understand, right? With the introduction of AI, now we're able to do that at scale. Real-time feedback, right? Sometimes, for example, if you take a classroom where you have a test and you have 20, 30, 40 questions, well, that teacher that's teaching will have to go through every single question across every single student, right? So it takes time to do that. AI can do that at a much faster pace and actually give you that feedback of when you get it wrong, why did you get it wrong? And let me figure out how we actually now tailor something so you actually grab the whatever you got wrong correctly. As I mentioned, right, adaptive in real time. It's very, very efficient, right? So we're leaving out kind of energy consumption and computation, but it is very efficient from the lens of an educator and a learner. And continuous adaptation, right? Like, hey, instead of having a teacher that can actually now adapt a particular course or a particular curriculum and actually do it by all these users, with the introduction of AI, we're able to do things at a much faster pace from a, hey, if this is the particular content and you got things wrong, then I can immediately now adapt to it so that next week, the month after, 6 months after, I can actually present it to you in a very different way to see what way actually clicks for that particular person, right? And that's all automated, can be done through AI. So why do we want it in personalization? Back to the point of today's skills will become less and less relevant. So we want to make sure that we give all of our employees and the workforce all the tools that they need to be able to then succeed in what we're looking at from a sector over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And these are the questions that we're trying to kind of come up with. Yeah, what happens when we can all do everything? What differentiates us in the workforce, as we mentioned before? Could universal skill mastery really create that inequality? What about on experiences? Are we going to be judged by experiences or technology or networks or relationships? All sorts of different things kind of arise when you start taking skills as a differentiator for humans. And this is the big one that I always kind of talk about is a lot of people when they think about, okay, well, AI is going to come in and actually disrupt and take my job. It was the same thing that happened during the Industrial Revolution, right? So we've seen this historically throughout human evolution, is that when you introduce something that takes away from something else, you're always going to be creating something new. And to use the example of the Industrial Revolution, what happened is that machinery came in and actually completely just dismantled that line worker kind of concept, right? Of having a bunch of people lined up and doing different parts of machinery, for example. So as it eradicated that whole sector, what it did was introduce machinery. And those machines need to be maintained, they need to be installed, they need to be designed, they need to have software on them, right? So you're now creating this whole ecosystem about something that just replaced an entire workforce, right? So that is something with AI that we always, and nobody has the right answer, but it's something that if we're constantly thinking about what areas of opportunity and what areas is going to create in the future, then we can jump the gun and figure out, well, how do we educate our workforce to be able to then handle those changes and really capitalize on the opportunities that something like AI brings to the table. All right, so evidence-based building blocks. So here's a learner assessment. So the thing that we need to do here is, because we're thinking about humans, right, individuals. Well, the only way that we can personalize it is if we actually figure out how do we actually profile this person to understand a little bit about them, so that we can actually personalize the curriculum. So we always start with the role, right? Like, hey, what is the role that this person has? Is it an executive role? Is it more down the line? Is it like a repetitive kind of workflow, right? So we need to understand what role and responsibility, this, we call the learner is. From that, we need to also gauge what the prior knowledge is, right? It's a very famous thing that we always see in consulting, that people say, well, I've been doing it for 20, 30 years. I mean, that's great. That means that you're experienced at doing that one thing, but doesn't mean that it's the right thing. So we need to also assess whether the prior knowledge is just a human behavioral, or it's because they actually don't have the right tooling and they don't have prior knowledge, or they have somewhere in the spectrum of fully understanding with not fully understanding. So we always want to assess where they are in terms of what you're trying to teach. We also need to establish the goals. This is tied directly to incentives, right? And we basically self-motivation in terms of like, well, why do I want to do this? Okay, well, the goal is to be able to then take an approach to opportunities that AI is going to present in the future. And this is what the goal of this whole kind of course is, right? So we also want to establish what the goals are for the learner. We also need to figure out what the constraints are, right? This is something that we think about. We're very kind of privileged here in the first world country where we have internet and we have all the resources that we have. But when you start thinking about how you learn, well, we need to think about devices, right? We need to think about the timing, family things. Like, for example, if I have 2, 3 kids and I have to drive them in the morning because my spouse also works, well, how does that actually work? Right. So I need to understand the constraints of this human or the constraints of the learner to be able to then tailor something that really sticks to the learner. Right. It can't just be, hey, 4-hour session at nighttime and you have a family of a bunch of young kids. Like, you're probably not going to have that time early on, maybe, towards the evening. So we need to really profile that and really understand it. And this is a really important one is the self ratings. A lot of things like just self evaluations and there's the reality of something or the perception of what that something should be. So understanding where a learner is based from a confidence level into what they're actually talking about and being able to then rectify that against where we want them to be also gives you insights in terms of what the curriculum should be or what the personalization should be. So let's start with a few building blocks. So the first thing is everyone kind of looks at a curriculum when you have a big book. For example, if you're having a history book and you're taking history classes, you're not going to cover that whole book in an hour. You're not going to cover it in a day. So what you do is that you actually start splitting it up. You split it up into maybe eras, or you split it up maybe into leaders or particular events throughout history. So we always want to create a micro module kind of framework where we can actually understand how these things have context, and how you split that in context could be very different depending on the intended goal that you want for the learner. You always need to have this retrieval practice, right? So it's great to kind of showcase and teach what these things are and the concepts, but we also have to have some type of retrieval practice to say, okay, well, can you actually retrieve in memory what you actually learned about these things and be able to actually reason and explain what these things are? So there's a pattern of, okay, well, I'm learning these micro modules. I need to be able to retrieve that information, and can I actually give it back the right way? Spaced repetition is another really building block, because you can learn everything and within 3 days, what happens is that your brain actually starts forgetting unless you're practicing it every day. So spaced repetition is something that AI can also start structuring depending on what the self-confidence and the goal is over time. So the more you have from a weekly or daily or routine where you're all constantly kind of looking at these concepts, the more it's actually going to be able to stick, and the more you're actually going to be able to achieve those goals that you've set before. And the last one is the mastery threshold, right? There is a gap of all the knowledge on a particular content. There's a particular amount that you think you have, and then measuring that allows you to then figure out how do you actually carve out those micro modules, or how do you actually maybe change the micro modules and actually group them from a different way. So there's all sorts of different strategies that you can do here to be able to then increase that mastery threshold with these very simple building blocks. When we take these building blocks, then we need to figure out, okay, well, how do we actually slice this content so it actually sticks, right? That's the whole title of the presentation. So the learner, the first thing as we continue kind of peeling back from what we mentioned of those kind of 4 categories is, okay, well, now how do we actually do this? What does a profile look like for a particular user? So that prior knowledge, that could be done by objective or a particular score, right? So we need to be able to actually use either heuristics or something that gives us direction. That's I'll talk about in a couple of slides. The confidence that allows us to then calibrate and figure out, okay, well, where is this particular user with the prior knowledge and the confidence to be able to actually tell us what they've learned about this particular subject or about this particular kind of content module. So we need to understand the time and context constraints, and what this is could be minutes per day, it could be length of session, it could be devices, it could be attention span, it could be all sorts of different kind of measurable things that you could have to figure out what those constraints are for the individual. Because if you don't actually have the presence and time to be able to actually just do that one thing, then it's what happens in a lot of enterprises, right? You have this kind of session in the back, you're reading through it, and you're just kind of skipping, waiting until the end, and then taking a quiz. Well, it might be because there's other things that you're valuing from a time perspective, so we need to understand that. The goal orientation, as I mentioned before, right? Like, hey, are you doing this for mastery or are you doing this for performance, right? Sometimes you don't have to be 100%, but 70% of the time, it's good enough for what you do from a daily perspective. So are there any type of date requirements? Is there something that, for example, if you're going to take a Google certification, is that something that we need to have before the end of the year because there's some particular business constraints, right? So we need to think about, okay, well, do we have to work backwards, or is this something that is just more proactive learning path to upskill all of our workforce, right? So those are important things to understand from the profile of the learner as we collect this information. Social learning preferences, this is also a big thing, and I think it's going to become more prevalent with AI, especially because what AI really does in the workforce is it's almost forcing you now to not collaborate with your peers. So a very typical engagement, and anyone that, if you're in a working, which all of us are in a working environment, a lot of the work kind of intricacies really lie in the communication and who you actually reach out to that has the information that you need. So when you start kind of grabbing all of that and you start creating these knowledge management systems and you start creating these kind of agentic workflows where you no longer need to collaborate, well, what does that do to the psyche, right? Is that going to change cultural? Is that going to change the way that I learn or perceive things? Because now I'm really leaning on a crutch, which is really on the technology side. So is there something from a social perspective that will also allow you to kind of learn a bit more, especially when you have this peer review or peer accountability? Humans by nature, we don't want to be left out. We want to feel as part of a group. So that could be something that you can also collect from a learner to build a profile and then figure out how do you actually personalize that. And you can kind of group those people together as well. Language and reading level, this is another one, right? Are you, depending on the work that you do or responsibility, like, what is kind of like your either your reading efficacy, what your primary language, what your words per minute are, like, jargon tolerance, do you do well with acronyms? Like, getting all of that allows us to then also go into number three, which is the time and context constraints, right? Because if we know that you're a fast reader and you can actually retain that information, then our timing constraint is going to be a little bit smaller because you're a fast reader. But somebody that actually needs to read things 2, 3, 4 times, well, that now curriculum or that module is going to be completely different because it's going to be cut up very differently based on that. And then the feedback preference, right? One of the things that we said that AI does really well here is being able to give you that feedback immediately, right? You don't need to wait for a human or a mentor or a professor or a teacher's assistant to come in and actually give you like, this information, or your boss, for example. So in this scenario, we can actually also figure out, well, do you like feedback with examples? Do you want to be challenged first? Like, how much hints do you want, right? So like these are all things and kind of, as I mentioned, building blocks that you're really kind of building upon and building that profile of that learner. And then lastly is really that risk and compliance sensitivity. So there's a lot of curriculum that you may want to teach the workforce where there is compliance or risk sensitivity around that. That typically is for things that, if you're in an environment where you need to have HIPAA compliance or you need to be PCI because you're processing payments, like that is really important to know, because the consequence of the error there, if you don't understand what you're doing, could be very, very high. In other things, it might just be the learning, for example. But in regulated industry, especially, there are things that you need to do for compliance. So there is some sensitivity there, and there's a smaller threshold of error given what you're actually, teaching from a workforce perspective. All right. So the stuff to learn. So this is the one that always kind of tricks up people, right? Because they say, okay, well, if I have this kind of content, right? I have this module, for example, I can't change the content for 1,000, 15,000. Like, I can't do that. And that's correct, right? What we're trying to do here is not recreate the content, right? So the main content should not change. What you're actually doing is reshaping what the actual user sees, right? So we have this learner profile that we know what the preferences are. We know how they learn best. We know the time constraints. We know all of that. And then we're looking at the curriculum or the actual module, the learning module, and say, okay, well, based on all this criteria, I can now start shifting this to be able to then give you what you need, right? So you start seeing a little bit more of, it could be a difference in order. It could be a difference in the speed that it does it. It could be a difference in how you cut up that particular content over 2 weeks, or if there's a day constraint or some type of deadline, then you work backwards from that, right? So there's a lot of different things that the content needs to now almost expand, but it doesn't actually change the core content, right? So that's a really important principle to understand, is that the content should not change. It should be how you deliver the content that really changes from a personalization perspective. So same thing, right? The prior knowledge is really allows us to understand the entry point and the sequence. So if you see what we're doing here, we're tying all the things that we have from the learner, and now we're actually trying to tie it into the content and see what that gives us from a curriculum design perspective. The confidence then allows us to have the practice mix, right? If you're very confident, then maybe the practice mix is a little bit lower, or depending on what those signals are that we'll talk about, maybe you change up a bit of how you actually deliver the content. The time and context constraints really give us that chunk size, right? So if we actually do all these micro modules, well, how big are these micro modules? And are they micro enough to do it, or are they too big, or are they too small? So the modality and also the devices, right? Is it somebody that's on the go that needs to be able to do this? Well, then maybe we have to kind of think about the content from a small device rather than a desktop, for example. Goal orientation then allows us to basically track milestones and be able to have a dashboard. Even if they're not hard KPIs, you can still track through heuristics, what that goal could be. And you always want to have that kind of progress, because that's really what incentivizes people to finish. Humans by nature don't like seeing things that are not 100%. So there's a lot of visual cues that you can build into that goal orientation of what you're trying to achieve from a teaching perspective. The social learning preference is a really interesting one, and I think we're going to. I believe we're probably going to see more and more of this, specifically because you're going to have less of what I mentioned before of that like relationship with a particular somebody in, a colleague, for example, that you need information, but no longer you have to interact with them because AI is in the middle. So I think the social learning might be a big component moving forward where you actually grab everyone in a room to either discuss or be able to trial or do anything around the content. So then it actually sticks. And then you also have other peers kind of discussing things that maybe didn't work for them. So you start kind of putting them into that. We're also doing a lot of stuff in office hours. So every time that we do, workshop, seminar, or anything that we really are teaching, what we do is that we immediately, the day after, for example, we open up office hours, and that's when we allow people to come in and actually give us, questions and be able to actually open up. What happens a lot is that because things are not personalized and things are very kind of one size fits all, as we talked about, a lot of people don't feel comfortable kind of saying, hey, I don't know this, I want to cover this in such a wide environment. But as soon as you do open office hours, for example, and you do like that social preference of it, people start talking and they feel more comfortable, right? So that's a really important key to understand from the learner perspective that impacts the stuff that you learn. Language and reading level allows us to do like obviously like what is the glossaries and everything around that. Is there any words, like if you speak multiple languages, is there anything that needs to also be packaged so you also understand the references, especially in things like Spanish and Romance languages? There's a lot of kind of overlap and there's a lot of nuances between them, so it's also important to maybe have that kind of correlation as it looks at the stuff that it needs to actually give you and be able to tailor it for that user. Feedback and preferences allows us the amount of the spacing of those particular points, or the actual points where you're actually learning or doing practice, for example. And then there is compliance and sensitivity allows us to create the thresholds and the gating, right? Hey, within this gate, unless you surpass this, you cannot get out of here because there is some type of legal compliance or something that we need to abide by in a regulated industry, for example. All right, so what does a system like this typically, will look like? And again, it's not technical. You can take these components and actually do it with various different tools, and we can always talk about that at the end. But essentially, this is a system that now you can actually put all these different things around it and really create that personalized environment with AI really doing a lot of the big lift. So you have the prior knowledge, right? So here is what I have from my experiences, right? So from there, then you have this kind of curriculum. Okay, well, there's right from here, you have the confidence level against your prior knowledge, right? So what you actually know versus what you feel confident, there's always a discrepancy there, right? And that's the part that we're going to measure further down the system. So with that, you then have a curriculum, and that also has the time and context constraints. How much do we actually break this up with? How much do we actually show? Do we spread them every other day? Do we spread them on a weekly perspective, right? So then that comes up in the system that you're building. That then needs to be oriented with some type of goal, right? A lot of these could be personal. Most of them are really business goals that you want to make sure that you uptrain your employees, or you want to make sure that you're covered from a compliance perspective. So it needs to be oriented towards the goal. From that, we have the social learning preferences that are tied now to the curriculum and the time and context constraints of that particular individual. And then that allows us to then be able to, this is blocking my, there we go. So then you have the language and reading level that is also tied to the curriculum and the time and the context. You have the feedback preferences, right? That goes back. And what that allows us to do is that it actually goes to that risk and compliance sensitivity. So this is where we also gate in terms of like, well, if your prior knowledge is here, we need you to actually be at this particular level. And that is where the feedback preference comes in and goes back into the into the gating system of what actually needs to happen. And the only way we can do that is by measuring the confidence, the prior knowledge, and comparing it directly to the risk compliance. And then what happens is that this all nicely comes back. And as you continue to measure, then you continue to say your prior knowledge now has grown since the last time you've done this, which then the curriculum also adapts. It actually changes with time and context, and then you retrieve it. Then it gives you a feedback, you measure, and it's a cycle, right? So the reason why we create systems like this is because they're iterative and they are also a cycle in itself, right? There's no one-off, there's no ad hoc. You're feeding what you're actually learning back into the whole experience. And the timing component of this is it's really the critical piece here. So we've done models where we've had, depending on what needs to have, especially like, let's just take sales. When you're doing sales, you also want to make sure that first the person understands the product that they're selling. They also understand the nuances, and then they also have that kind of relationship building capability that salespeople need to have. So we've done systems where we've actually measured and come up with a rubric that says if you score within these particular ranges, your actual touch base or that feedback loop that we're talking about is actually less frequent, right? So maybe once a month, once every couple of months. If your knowledge is actually a little bit lower than that, then we're actually going to start carving out that curriculum in a very different way, but it's going to be more frequent and it's going to be in a shorter lifespan to make sure that we get you to a higher confidence level and also improve your prior knowledge. So as you see, this works across the board from all sorts of kind of learning paths for different individuals. I put here that I lost my Zoom window. Okay. All right. So what happens once we actually have the system in place and we have all the tools and we have these beautiful dashboards? What do the signals tell us? If we take the system, what can we look at and how do we actually start measuring and how do we actually tell AI to be able to then start carving out that curriculum? So the first thing that we always have correlation between is going to be low score and high confidence. Oh, I think somebody has a hand raised. Is that right, Shannon? Do I see them? Let me see.
Yeah, Alyssa, I'm not sure. Maybe we can let you off mute here. Let's see. Or if you want to type your question into the Q&A box, that's helpful too.
Okay, either way. Okay, yeah, you can type it if you're having some challenges getting off of mute. So when we have a low score and a high confidence, well, that allows us to maybe do remediation and then have some type of calibration quizzes and then worked examples. This is usually the I am an expert on things, but even though when you actually look at the content and you test, you actually don't test very well. So there's a different path that you need to take. There's a different path that AI can take to be able to then remediate that low score and high confidence. So the actual score then matches your prior knowledge, really matches that confidence, right? So that really, because the only way we can really kind of achieve that is through confidence calibration quizzes to make sure that we really understand whether you're actually understanding what we're trying to teach you or actually lower the bar from a score perspective. There we go. High score and limited time. Well, okay, so then that means that we have to have some type of accelerated path, right? So if you have a very high score and you have not, a lot of time, maybe a little kind of 7-minute refreshers every time is good, right? Maybe you wake up in the morning and your AI says, okay, great, this is what we're trying to learn over the next 3 weeks. Here's what I have to give you in the next 7 minutes, right? So you can actually now tailor this and say, okay, well, we're going to carve out 7-minute modules every single morning. And it's gonna follow this particular path of the micro modules, right? Or maybe the micro modules are actually changed in a way that is a little bit easier to understand in very, very small blocks, right? So you maybe have fewer explainers and more concepts because you already have a high score. So we don't want to give you information that's going to be boring or it's going to make you disengage. So we want to also be able to calibrate for that. As I mentioned before, maybe you don't have, depending on the field, maybe you don't have a computer, maybe you only have a phone. Well, then maybe we can leverage things like text, right? You can say there's daily text throughout the day about particular things about this subject that you're trying to learn over the next 3-4 weeks. You could do transcripts for video. So you say, hey, here's a video, but we're sending you a transcript through the phone just in case you don't have the data, or you don't have the connectivity or the access to be able to download these things, right? So you have those kind of targets and downloadable summaries so they can actually then read it directly from their phone and not necessarily through a laptop or through some type of a video conference. Mastery oriented. So these are progress bars. There's a PR missing there. Progress bars to proficiency and then really reflect on mistakes, right? So when we go back and we look at the goals, we have, okay, well, are you doing mastery? Are you really going for mastery or you're going for performance? So if you're going in mastery, then we need to really make sure that the mistakes that you're making on the content, that we really surface them and reflect on those to make sure that you really understand the concepts to really then raise your mastery, right? So that's on the mastery aspect. When we look at performance oriented, then you have things like leaderboards, benchmarks, you have time to competency targets, so you can make this fun for the workforce as well. So there's all sorts of kind of triggers and incentives that you can do, not only from a curriculum perspective, but from a business perspective to look at it from a holistic approach, right? So those are kind of two of the goals that we see mostly, right? There's either mastery that's typically really from a personal level or led from a personal level, and then the performance, which is typically from a business perspective, especially as we mentioned, things like sales. Um, if you want concept first, well, then maybe there's a thing. There's if you learn through concepts and then you need all the evidence and the kind of small details to be able to then make sure that you understand that concept, then maybe that's the way that it's broken up. Okay, I can say, hey, I'm going to give you a really big kind of concept, and then I'm going to break it down into the details, and then I'm going to give you some cases, and then I'm going to establish a pattern that actually really learns to how you're actually taking these concepts first. And then when you have a low self-reg, what happens here is you want to also have kind of these pre-scheduled sessions. So if you have a lot of people that kind of fall into this category, then something, instead of having this one size fits all and just have this particular curriculum, you can always have a pre-scheduled session, right? And this could be automated, it could be led by a particular human, but AI can actually give the content on how that should be done because it's part of this holistic kind of learning experience that you're giving your employees or your customers. A checklist also work really well. Hey, you need to learn this. You need to learn numbers 2 to 5. So that also is a mechanism for them to be able to actually learn and make sure that the information sticks. If you have really high self-reg from that perspective, then you can actually loosen a lot of the kind of scaffolds that you build beforehand and be able to actually just get a lot more done from that perspective, right? So a lot of this, when you're looking at these signals, if you are not measuring these or looking at them from this perspective, you're not going to be able to actually, feed what AI needs to be able to then continue iterating on the different kind of KPIs that we capture. All right, so how do we apply this from a high level? And I'm going to give you a couple of things that you can do. Uh, you can have, without getting too much into the detail, from a multi-agentic workflow, really what that means, agents are basically LLMs that have all these tools, right? So if you really think about, okay, well, how would I actually take this particular curriculum, no matter where it's authored or no matter where it kind of lives on the internet, how do I now take this and then apply it to, let's just say myself, right? I want to learn this, but I don't know how to actually, I need to have something personalized, right? So imagine you're creating your own private tutoring team. So this private tutoring team could be a chunking tutor, which actually looks at all the content that you're trying to do. And because it knows you from your profile, that learner profile that we created before, it knows how it needs to actually chunk all the information that you gave it. You also have a mapping tutor that says, okay, well, based on those goals that we learned from your profile, here's how we're going to map those particular chunks to those goals and how we're actually going to be able to reach those particular goals. Then you have a planning tutor that says, okay, well, now that we have the particular pieces and we know what is mapping to the particular goal, now this AI tutor can actually say, now we're going to plan your lessons. So we're going to plan all of these particular things that also map to your goals, right? So you start seeing how AI starts looking at it from different perspectives, from multi-agentic workflow, right? That's just one example of how you can do this. And then for a lot of the middle and upper management, what you can also add on there beyond the models and lessons is an executive tutor. So this is something that we're seeing a lot in the industry right now, where you're basically creating these, highly CTO kind of personas, or you're a CMO persona, right? Somebody that is almost like your co-pilot that works with you. So anything that after you take courses or you actually do the learning or however you've actually gotten to that point, you have this thing that is constantly giving you advice or really asking for more information about the things that you're doing to make sure that if you're not, or at some point you level off or a lot of the learning is starting to be forgotten, that executive tutor can work with the other three to be able to then re-engage and actually make sure that you focus on the parts that are starting to fall off from memory, right? Or from the understanding or reasoning. So this is something that you can do today with OpenAI. This is something that you could do with Anthropic. You could do with any kind of these platforms. Very easily, right? Just with English, right? You don't need to write any software. You need to write anything like that, but you think about it like that, right? 4 different agents, 4 different purposes that work together to create that tutoring team that I have based on my profile and the thing that I want to learn. Something new that OpenAI just launched about 3 weeks ago with GPT-5 is that now they actually have a specific study agent. So that's something that you could also add to the tool set. Copilot also has something very similar, but with OpenAI specifically, for example, if you actually create a thread that says, hey, you're going to be a study agent, what it will do is that as you ask questions about what you're trying to learn, it's not going to give you the answer. It's actually going to probe you to get to the answer yourself, right? Almost think about it as somebody that a really philosophical teacher that is really trying to make you learn by just asking you questions rather than give you the answers. So that's already kind of built into OpenAI. So that could be one of the tools that you could also use to reinforce that learning and make sure that everything that you're trying to get your workforce to understand and learn actually gets done, and you actually make them really kind of understand it and make it stick, because you're constantly having this thing always asking you questions rather than giving you the answers, right? So it's a good kind of plug-in to do something like that. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other ones, but if you start looking at the big companies, I think this is something that's going to be it's going to be very prevalent. There was a OpenAI, you can find this, I think about 2 days ago. They published an article. I think it was a sample size of like 1.1 million queries of since they've been, kind of recording all the questions that people put on LLMs, and I think about 25% of that was practical guidance. So when you look at kind of copilots for like a study agent, and you have a curriculum that fits exactly with what a quarter of the people are actually looking to get out of OpenAI, right? So that's a really important key point, because you're leaning into what the market is telling you, not trying to dictate your own kind of like your own process on top of it. So yeah, as I mentioned, right, this really pushes you to kind of critically think about your questions. So why does it rain? It's not going to give you the whole process. It's going to say, well, what do you think happens to water when it evaporates, right? So it's going to kind of go through that exercise. And if you haven't tried it, it's actually really it's a great kind of challenge for everyone to go in and actually use the study agent. It makes you kind of reason and think, which then allows you to then retain information for longer. So some risks and guardrails. Obviously, there's always something that we have to put into these kind of initiatives. Is don't start without a benchmark, because you're not going to be able to actually measure KPIs. You're not going to be able to even get any type of information that you can compare and actually give you whether you're improving or not. So always make sure that you have something. It doesn't have to be perfect. Like I said, I mentioned a couple of times, are great. They're there for a reason. So you can use heuristics to actually even measure before you even start or go down this path of personalized learning. Hallucinations, there's a lot of different technical kind of implementations that you can use to make sure that you mitigate a lot of the hallucinations. So always be aware of that, and make sure that you have some type of kind of mechanism within your team or within your enterprise that allows you to review the answers and what those kind of modules are being cut up to for every single person. Bias and fairness, this obviously goes with anything. The same it goes with humans. The same thing that it applies with AI agents is just make sure that as part of that hallucination kind of feedback within your team, you're also able to look if it is introducing bias or if it's not being fair for whatever reason. Privacy is obviously a huge one, right? You don't want particular personalized lessons and questions and conversations to leak for various reasons. So privacy is top of mind. And then, of course, the biggest thing of why most projects fail is the change management aspect of it, right? So you have to really think about what is it that we're trying to accomplish? How do we actually communicate it to the organization? How do we communicate it to the learners? How do we explain this whole thing? And how do we actually make it very easy for them to understand it, so then they also become our ambassadors? So how to measure, as I continue mentioning, ranges, heuristics, anything that allows you to measure. As you start going through this exercise, you will see that for every company is a little bit different. And that's completely okay, because you're actually measuring towards your goals that you've established as a company. So it's completely okay to use heuristics. Time to competency is a good one, right? So if you say, hey, on average, we know that around 2 weeks within this particular module, people are at this competency. Well, if we start doing AI personalized training, does that time go up? Does that time go down? And really understanding what happens from that psychological aspect. The number of support tickets. So this is a really big one for HR departments. It's really big to put like knowledge management. And of course, there's a lot of training involved. But sometimes it happens like, hey, can I do this? Is it in policy? Am I violating policy? So if you're looking at support tickets on how to, for companies and like internal, external employees or contractors, you can also measure what happens with support tickets after we use a tool to actually be able to personalize that learning afterwards. Course completion. You can also say, well, how many people start a course and then never finish it? Well, with AI, you can also say, if we have personalized training, does our course completion actually go up or down, right? What is the kind of engagement? So thinking about engagement and being able to somewhat be able to measure that. Content ops savings. So a lot of this is, okay, well, because I'm just really writing one curriculum and I have this AI system that's going to personalize it for my entire workforce, there's a lot of content off savings, right? Because you no longer have to, okay, well, I have to do this for this department and it's got this flavor, this other department that's got this flavor. It just kind of does it by an individual level, knowing what your responsibilities are. As I mentioned, the most important thing here is make sure that your KPIs are directional and it gives you some type of North Star where you're going, even if they're not perfect. It is something that is actually going to push you in the right direction. So what we covered today, problem that we were solving, which is personalized learning. We talked a little bit about what we're seeing in the industry, some of the insights that we see in the workforce. When we talked about skill sets in the long term, we defined what personalized training is. We did a little bit of the basic building blocks in terms of how we actually create this persona, how do we create the actual learner, and then how do we take the actual curriculum and then break it up into the system that continues to iterate on itself. And then how do we actually use AI to personalize the particular training for the workforce. So that's all I have. 10:50 on the mark. If you have any questions, I didn't see anything coming through the chat, but
I think there's two in there now, one from Melissa.
okay. Oh, I don't see it here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the last message I see is
I can ask.
Shannon. You said, did you have a question?
Oh, I'm in the Q&A box. Fernando and Kristen are saying excellent presentation. Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Question, how do you address the issue of personal preference when people claim they want in-person training, but then do not attend in-person training that's offered when multiple sessions and locations are offered? I feel like a lot of people feel your pain, Melissa.
Oh yeah, and unfortunately, there's not enough AI in the world to be able to fix that problem. Doesn't matter how bad you try, but if you really kind of step back from an educational perspective or even just motivation, when you look at individuals and they say X and they do Y, you need to really understand that why they're doing that, right? Could it be because, oh, something's coming. So could it be because maybe they're not just the value, right? Like there's a lot of different things that could go into that decision of being able to do that. Now, as I mentioned, I do believe that AI is going to start streamlining a lot of these things, but I think there's going to be a natural movement to go back into person to really cultivate relationships that matter and really kind of engage at a very different level that we have not engaged, right? This whole concept of colleagues, because we work in the same office and we just mentioned them colleagues, if you start removing that colleague and you start adding that kind of friendship or personal touch, that also is going to incentivize people to go into an in-office training. So from a summary perspective, it's not just, oh, do we do it in person or do we do it online? You should do all kinds of different things, right? Because when we're talking about personalization could also be there's going to be for the people that want to be in person, there's people that are going to be online, and that's completely okay, right? But the more you do those, you start profiling and understanding what that learner profile looks like for them, and then you start kind of figuring out the why. And then there's just people that you're going to have that are going to be your outliers that just complain to complain and they don't want to be engaged or anything like that. So, but that's also really important to know.
Awesome. Okay, actually, a few questions. So Dana's question, our org recently implemented an AI customer support bot that can instantly generate relatively personalized grow your skills content based on specific individual customer needs. This has been effective for immediate support, and it's raised strategic questions for our customer education team about the future role of our formal digital training programs and certifications, considering that folks seem to want immediate answers to specific questions. How do you see the relationship evolving between personalized, on-demand, AI-generated learning content and structured training programs? Specifically, what should customer ed or enablement teams be focusing on when designing and marketing our formal personalized training offerings to ensure that they provide unique value that complements rather than competes with other AI-generated content?
That's a great question. And remember what we said from a foundational perspective. Structure, just because it's structured doesn't mean that it cannot be personalized, right? If you have a structure of this particular thing, what you're basically saying there is we know all of our users are going to want this particular structure with steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. As soon as you step out of that paradigm and you say, hey, we know that these are the outcomes that we want to achieve, the process of how to get there becomes less relevant than the actual goal itself. So when you look at structured programs, it's completely okay, but you want to look at it from what is the final goal that I want to achieve, and then the structure from there allow AI to then be able to interpret and be free enough to say, okay, well, I know that you want this particular structure and this is the goal that you want to achieve, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit to make sure that people can actually basically tweak it to the person itself, right? And the way that they learn best. And when I mean tweak, it doesn't mean add or remove information. It means the presentation or the sequence of things, or even basically doing analogies on certain things may be a little bit different for different people, right? So it doesn't mean that just because of structure, you can have this kind of personalized, generated learning. I'm just going to read the question one more time just to make sure that I actually captured everything that you said. Yeah, AI generated learning, I'm guessing. Yeah. Okay. So if I take a deeper dive in there, and we have a few minutes, but if I take a deeper dive and kind of reinterpreting what you meant from a personalized on-demand AI generated learning versus structured training programs, I think what you may be asking here is what happens with people that when they learn, they go to ChatGPT, they get this answer, and then that is what they run with because now it becomes, becomes basically the answer that they were looking for. It may be right or it may be wrong. You can't control that, but I don't think that will ever kind of separate because it's the same way as if you're going to a business and a business tells you, hey, here's all the things that you need to know because we're Wall Street and this is how we actually sell options. That person still can go to the library, still can go to articles. It has nothing to do with AI, right? People are always going to find ways. And the reason why they find ways is because maybe it's not sticking, maybe it's not personalized to them. So I don't see that relationship being mutually exclusive. I actually see them, go together very well. The structure gives you a bit more of a level for the business, while the generated AI kind of content can give you information from a personal perspective. So I think they overlap in a lot of that. Hopefully, one of those two kind of captures your question because it was a great question. There's just a lot of layers in that question.
She said, good perspective. Thank you. We are going to go ahead. We're going to wrap up here. I know there's a few questions that we didn't get to, so we will follow up with you and make sure that you get answers to your questions. Thank you, Antonio, for sharing. If you can just one click slide here on the screen. And then next up, we have a webinar with Meta. We're going to be talking about certification best practices with Meta's certification program manager, our exam program manager, Maria. So we'll see you there. Thank you, everybody, for jumping in today, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everyone.